me. And certainly my first time here, but hopefully not my last. It's been a very...
Sorry, just my fault.
Okay, it's fine. Yeah, so as I was saying, my first time here in, well, both Warsaw and Poland. Hopefully not my last. It's been a very productive, very convivial conference. And being in the very final slot, I've had quite a long time of relaxing and just enjoying papers. And now it's my turn on the stage. And I'm going to talk to you, of course, about digital adaptations of the classics for the Gen Z audience. And before I get started with my lecture proper, I'd just like to see how much you know about this topic. As Lucy has already said, we had a little bit of a preview in the previous session for those of you who were there, but how many of you have seen a web series adaptation of a classic text? Oh, so there we go, reasonable number. Of those of you who put your hand up, how many have seen the Lizzie Bennet diaries? Okay, that seems to be the most popular one. Have any of you seen Maggie Hale's Corner or Public History, a David Copperfield web series? No one? Not even Isabella? Oh, did someone put their hand up? Oh, the North and South one? Yeah, okay. Well, that's good for me to know. So I think there's a good general basis, but the examples I'm talking about are very unknown and not very popular and not very visible. So I'm talking more about real sort of grassroots, popular culture, digital culture, and that's going to be my focus. And so, sadly, I'm not really surprised by your responses because of the web series adaptation genre, it's really the Lizzie Bennet diaries that is the best known. And the genre basically owes its existence to the Lizzie Bennet diaries. According to an interview in Fan Phenomena Jane Austen, the origins of this prototypical convergence era adaptation lie in a meeting between producers Bernie Sue and Hank Green. And this was a meeting I had with the co-writer Margaret Dunlap. And Dunlap explained how over coffee, Bernie Sue told her about a plan he and Hank Green were working on to adapt novels in the public domain into a vlog-style series for a young female audience. Dunlap continues by suggesting that she says something like, "Oh, so like Pride and Prejudice on YouTube." Sue might have blinked for a second, and then he said, "Actually, it's exactly Pride and Prejudice on YouTube." So the Lizzie Bennet diaries then takes an out of copyright text that was already hugely popular in contemporary culture and made it appeal directly to that young female audience of the early to mid 2010s. Sue, Green, and Dunlap took a savvy gamble which paid off. Multiple web series produced by the Pemberley Digital team, such as Emma Approved and Frankenstein MD, which we heard about in the last panel, and also a huge range of independent productions followed. And as a result, an entirely new self-referential adaptation genre had been born. The Lizzie Bennet Diaries has won critical plaudits, including, I think, an Emmy, and a hugely enthusiastic fan following, with episode 1 having been viewed currently 3.5 million times. And also collective rewatches, such as the Look Back Diaries from 2022, underlining the commitment of its fandom even a whole decade after the series first appeared. Lizzie Bennet and the Pemberley Digital oeuvre more generally have also received a decent amount of critical attention. Much of this has come in the form of articles and chapters by Austen scholars, including people like Jessica Seymour, Linda Troost, Sarah Greenfield, and Stephanie Russo. And Isabella Rudnicka, who gave a paper this morning, has also published a book chapter on Pemberley Digital. Oh, and I think, Anna, you said as well that you have a piece forthcoming on Pemberley Digital. You can see that it's definitely a popular subject for academic scrutiny. And I think all of this work culminates in the one academic monograph on this topic, and that's Jennifer Camden and Kate Faber-Astrike's Transmedia Storytelling, Pemberley Digital's Adaptations of Jane Austen and Mary Shelley. And this is the first book-length study of the trend, and it explores this ambiguously feminist, female-centered set of productions made by the successful web drama studio at more great length than those scattered articles and collection chapters that I just mentioned. In general, however, much less attention has been paid to the waves of much lower budget creativity that have taken the genre in new directions since the peak years of the literary-inspired web series in the Pemberley digital era. So in my lecture today, I want to do exactly that, and to broaden the scope of the critical attention paid to this adaptation genre. And it is an adaptation genre that I think it's safe to say has probably died out at this point in 2023. But nonetheless, I believe it had a very interesting life, even in the second half of the 2010s. And so since the watershed and genre-defining appearance of Hank Green and Bernie Sue's series in 2012, over 100 literary-inspired web series have aired on YouTube. And these cover a whole range of different classics, beyond the Lizzie Bennet diaries. The Shakespeare scholar Douglas Lanier has counted 52 Shakespeare web series. I'm not really going to talk about those today because I'm a Victorianist, sorry. So hope there are no Shakespeare fans. But we can talk about that later in the Q&A. So a lot of the 100 or so are Shakespeare adaptations. And there's a very strong Austen contingent, which will be in the background of my count today, around 20, according to my own count. And I think beyond that, the largest group of other web series adaptations of the classics are of 19th century novels, certainly Austen and Shelley, and then moving into Victorian novels as well. And so on the slide now, hopefully you just have a sense of the diversity of the types of classic web series adaptations of 19th century novels here through the years of this particular cultural phenomenon. And as you'll see later on, I'm going to talk about a few of these in more detail. So I believe it's an opportune moment to really expand the corpus of classic web series adaptations that are considered by adaptation scholars. And I want to include some of the adaptations that are on the slide here. And for me, this broadening of scope, it does more than just throw light on neglected individual examples. And instead, it really reveals a distinct set of cultural practices that are central to the fan community context of the literary-inspired web series, as it's operated since the Pemberley digital era and into the more the non-professional context that has followed in its wake. As tempting as it is to evaluate web series adaptations in terms of views, likes, and comments, I don't think this is a particularly productive model for considering the post-2016 context that's my main focus here in the rest of the lecture. And I think we can safely say this later era of the web series adaptation can't be defined as a success in those terms. So certainly, these videos are viewed usually by a couple of hundred people, at the height of their airing on YouTube. Nonetheless, I think it's still worth studying these adaptations, these examples, and they do provide fascinating evidence of an adaptation community at work. It's a different kind of process going on, I think. So what I'm actually going to be talking about today are the two examples of Maggie Hale's Corner from 2017, which is an adaptation of Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, and Public History, a David Copperfield web series from 2019 to 2020, which adapts Dickens's expansive autobiographical Kunstlerroman David Copperfield. I couldn't avoid Dickens, a bit like Natalie. There's some Dickens in this talk, but not only Dickens. So these series interest me in one sense as adaptations of two great mid-Victorian novels that I particularly love. Just very quickly, how many people are very familiar with David Copperfield and/or North and South? Are these quite familiar texts? Did any of the 18th century specialists put their hands up? So these are texts that I have written on, do really admire, really love as Victorian novels. But it also really fascinates me to see how these canonical works are reimagined in the web series context. And what I want to argue today, one of the main claims of the lecture, is that these later adaptations of classic 19th century texts represent a different way of doing the literary-inspired web series, which is in contrast to the Pemberley digital era, and they represent a kind of generational shift into the second half of the decade of the 2010s. So I'm tracking a different approach, a subtly distinctive approach to the web series genre. But I'm going to begin by saying this new approach to the web series adaptation isn't obvious at an aesthetic level. So these two productions function formally much like the earlier waves of web series adaptation, such as Lizzie Bennet Diaries, of course. And so with the conventions of the literary-inspired web series so well established, these adaptations are defined, much like the earlier examples, by their vlog style, direct address to camera, and the creation of an immersive reality effect in the way that the narrative unfolds slowly in serial form and across multiple different social media platforms. I'm not really going to talk too much about the transmedia elements or the interactivity. We can cover that in the Q&A if you would like later on. So they're much like the very first examples of web series adaptations. So where does their distinctiveness lie? Well, I think it's two main other areas that they are interesting for us to study. I think the first thing to note is that this later wave of classic web series does not feel the need to draw attention to the novelty of its form or to explain away the reason for the videos being made in the first place. And I think this is perhaps to be expected a number of years into the life of a popular form such as this. And you can imagine if the viewers of this particular type of digital adaptation are familiar with the conventions, then why bother with an elaborate setup explaining why the main characters of the series are vlogging in the first place, and so on. And indeed, as we'll see in due course, the refreshing lack of self-consciousness in this later generation of literary web series extends into their approach, the process of adaptation itself. So these series, in the main, make a concerted return to reread the source text itself and largely avoid in-jokes and knowing nods to other big-budget adaptations of the same literary works circulating in popular culture. So that's quite a difference to what we heard about in the previous panel, those of us who were. So I think this is a significant shift, but perhaps even more innovative than this textual turn is what I want to argue is a significant ideological shift in terms of these adaptations, representations of gender and sexuality in particular. So more specifically, Maggie Hale's Corner and Public History move away from the post-feminist approach familiar from Pemberley Digital towards a recontextualization of these classic novels that foregrounds LGBTQIA+ experience, also in the broader context of the societal issues prominent in Trump-era America. It is the case that earlier vlog adaptations are accepting of LGBTQIA identities and do feature gay and lesbian characters. And as Douglas Lanier notes in writing about the Shakespeare web series, these series are by and large queer positive. What is particularly striking about the later era of the literary web series, however, is just how much structural emphasis is placed on bringing marginalized identities to the very heart of these classic texts. So Maggie Hale's Corner, Public History, and a number of other web series adaptations of this later temporal period do go further than a replication of traditional fan fiction and slash fiction's extension of the erotic possibilities of mass narratives beyond conventional heterosexuality. So I'm going to talk about that more in the main central part of my lecture. So moving on to talk about my first example now in the first main section of the talk, and that's Maggie Hale's Corner. Interestingly, this first case study, Maggie Hale's Corner, is not the only web series adaptation of Elizabeth Gaskell's great industrial novel, North and South. The text was in fact adapted first in this context in 2015 as the unfortunately unfinished series East and West. And in this earlier version of North and South, Margaret Hale becomes a graduate student who's been uprooted by her parents, not to the north of England, but instead to Canada. So that's the east to west line there, of course. So lonely and a bit depressed, she begins recording her video diaries. And in them, we learn about her tutoring sessions with the local entrepreneur, John Thornton, who's an updated version of the Ernest Mill owner, Thornton, of course, in Gaskell's novel. Even in its very short run of only 6 episodes, this particular adaptation strikes a knowing and often amusing tone in its approach to the source text. And in that way, I think it's a bit more like many of the Pemberley Digital adaptations that I think some of you are more familiar with. So some examples of this more comic approach: the family's trusty housekeeper, Dixon, from Gaskell's novel, becomes Dixon the cat. And I think that's because, of course, the internet loves cat videos, the internet loves cats, but it also is a reference to the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, where one of the Bennet sisters, Kitty Bennet, actually becomes a literal kitty in that narrative. So see that intertextuality at play there as well. Episode 3 also makes a topical reference to Maggie watching the film version of The Hobbit. And she specifically mentions Thorin Oakenshield and tells the camera, if you take away the beard, he's so attractive. I've got to keep my eye on that actor. So this might just seem a topical, fairly superficial cultural reference, but it does operate on a number of levels. It certainly places Maggie in the same world as her viewers, since they may well also have been watching The Hobbit at that time when it was released. I think more interesting for our purposes here, though, is that it makes a knowing nod to the actor Richard Armitage. I know some of you have been looking forward to this. We've had discussions over coffee about this. And just in case you don't know, Armitage is part of the Gaskell adaptation universe, since he played John Thornton in the BBC's popular 2004 adaptation of Gaskell's North and South, which we can see here. So with this in-joke, East and West signals its self-awareness of the history of Gaskell on screen, and I think it also expects its audience to get the joke. So this particular small reference underlines the reliance of this earlier era of web series adaptation on previous generations of the classic adaptation. In a podcast interview, Maggie Hell's Corners creator, Lacey Shaw, has admitted that one of her key influences was also the 2004 BBC miniseries, which she watched due to what she calls a love for period shows. Despite this initial inspiration, this particular interpretation of Gaskell turns away from detailed interaction with this earlier big budget adaptation. And so this big budget adaptation, I think, has dominated reception of North and South over the past 20 years, maybe even of Gaskell's reception in general. But with Maggie Hell's Corner, Shaw instead takes us back to lots of detail from Gaskell's source text. And in explaining her approach to North and South, Shaw has talked about how she worked very carefully through the text, summarizing the main events of each of the 52 chapters, and thinking about how they would function as convincing blog episodes on screen. While, as we'll see in due course, this is very much a modernized 21st century take on Gaskell's novel, it does also stick strikingly closely to the contours of the source text's incident-packed narrative. So the web series manages to find space to dramatize or to describe some of North and South's most significant moments, such as, predictably enough, the strike scene, Margaret and Frederick's encounter with Leonard's on the platform of the railway station, and also Thornton's establishment of a workers' canteen. And perhaps most strikingly, and most unlike the romantic train station platform ending of the BBC adaptation, Maggie Hell's Corner rounds off its romance plot with a kiss and a version of the very last lines of North and South. In this case, however, when the lovers ponder together what Aunt Shaw and Mrs. Thornton will think of their relationship, this is how the scene works out. So I'm going to show you my first brief clip from Maggie Hell's Corner now. Hopefully this will work. So it's the very end of the series. Oh.
Well, I had hoped for maybe something more, but after everything I've done, I'm probably the last person you want to see.
Maggie, that couldn't be more untrue.
I have lied to you so much, and after everything, you deserve better than me.
No, we were both idiots, okay? Oh, I have something for you.
What?
I went to your little slice of paradise, and you just see what all the fuss was about.
Man, I can just imagine what your mother is thinking about this. That woman.
No, okay, your family. That woman?
Yeah.
What's my shortcut again to go to the slideshow? Since I can't see it with the Zoom, sorry.
No, it's just.
Oh yeah, sorry, I can see that. Right. So here we see with a slightly comic, playful inflection, the lines "that man and that woman" are replaced by "that woman and that woman." So I hope what this brief exchange will also have underlined is that this adaptation of North and South combines its very close attention to the main events of the narrative with an updating of those events into the 21st century. And more specifically, this is a female-centered LGBTQIA+ positive production. And intriguingly, I think this new approach to the source text distances Maggie Hale's Corner even further from Sandy Welch's influential TV version. The BBC North and South was, I think, Richard Armitage's breakthrough role, and the series really launched him into leading man territory. As Sarah Fanning has argued in a recent essay, the series' representation of Thornton reflects a continuing impulse to eroticize the male body in the serialized classic novel adaptation. The adaptations focus on Thornton's shared male experience, as Fanning puts it, and his close friendship with the mill hand Nicholas Higgins, nonetheless offers, as Fanning also points out, a potent way of softening and broadening Thornton's masculinity beyond a romantic hero. As I hope you'll have seen from the brief clip, Maggie Hale's Corner takes its interpretation of Gaskell's industrial novel in a very different direction, replacing the BBC adaptation's interest in male homosexuality with a focus on shared female experience that operates on both a romantic and a platonic level. As Lacey Shaw has explained in talking about this web series adaptation, one of her most significant choices was to turn Thornton into the female CEO of Marlborough Cosmetics. And in this modernized interpretation of the original novel, Maggie and Thornton encounter each other when the former moves to Milton, in part to support her father, who's left his church due to their attitudes about the LGBTQI community, and in part to report on the industrial strife in the city as a journalist working for an up-and-coming news platform. So Maggie, in this context, is a journalist. And after initial hostility on both sides and a recreation of the narrative as it unfolds in the miniseries in the novel, of course, both characters eventually enter a romantic relationship by the narrative's end. This querying of the romance plot might seem quite radical, but I think it's only a part of the emphasis of the adaptation as a whole, which intelligently places female and LGBTQIA narratives beyond Maggie and Thornton in the context of the experience of other marginalized groups. So maybe an interesting thing to notice is that Maggie Hale's Corner has an all-female cast. So Frederick Hale, of course, the brother in the source text, becomes Francie Hale, a young woman who was served in Iraq, and because of an incident that has happened there, has to stay away from the US and is currently living in Spain in exile and in a relationship with a woman named Lola. Nicholas Higgins, the operative, the workman, the father figure, is transformed into Nicole Higgins up there on the right, who is the supportive older sister in this context of Beth Higgins, Bessie Higgins, of course, in the source text, who's suffering from an unnamed terminal respiratory disease after having worked at Thornton's cosmetics factory since she was 16. So that's a sort of short summary of the main characters in this adaptation. And what I hope this summary will show is that Maggie Hale's Corner doesn't really focus on the characters' gender and sexual identities in isolation. It also updates North and South's interest in class politics and class identities. As Shaw herself has put it, this is a Victorian industrial novel updated for the Trump-era world, a world which is still dealing with poor working conditions, with subsistence-level wages. In this context, the adaptation heightens the difference between Maggie and Thornton by making this not only about class, but also about race. It was very important for Shaw and the team behind the adaptation that Jade Thornton be of an immigrant background, and she's fought against not only class prejudice, but also poor treatment resulting from her Latin American ancestry and identity. So North and South is adapted to suit 21st century realities, and is also, I think, tailored for the tastes and interests of the literary-inspired web series fandom. Before I move on to discussing my second example, Public History, a David Copperfield web series, I do want to stress how much these digital adaptations of this particular period are produced by and for this fan community. As we've seen, Maggie Hale's Corner features an all-female cast, and it's also the case that it's an all-female crew and people working on the production. Lacey Shaw herself, the creator, is from Maryland in the US, and she's been assisted by a team of writers from a range of different countries, including the UK, the Netherlands, and India. Other members of the team who we can see here, including Jessamine Lee and Hazel Jeffs, had experience of working on other digital adaptations of the works of Jane Austen and Thomas Hardy. And Jessamine Lee has since worked on a slightly bigger budget web series adaptation of Jane Austen's Persuasion called Rational Creatures. So, while Maggie Hale's Corner may not have made a huge impact in terms of number of views and social media interaction, it does nonetheless provide us, I think, with further fascinating evidence of an adaptation community at work. And this literary-inspired web series community is also very much in evidence as a context for my second example, which I'm going to turn to now, and that's Public History, the David Copperfield web series. Jules Piggott, who we can see here, the creator of Public History, a David Copperfield web series, can also trace her work as a director and writer of digital adaptations of the classics to her involvement with the literary-inspired web series fandom. So interestingly, though she says that she liked the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, she was never really a huge fan of it, and she drew her inspiration instead from Nothing Much to Do from 2014, which is a queer, positive, and community-focused adaptation of Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. I think this is significant as it already shows how Piggott's entry into the literary web adaptation world was inspired primarily by seeing the success of other young non-professional creators rather than necessarily being a fan or being impressed by the larger scale and bigger budget productions of Pemberley Digital. So in the time since her first Shakespeare adaptation, Like As It Is, appeared in 2015, and while finishing high school and studying English and film studies at university, Piggott has overseen a number of other long-form literary-inspired web series that foreground LGBTQIA+ representation. So these include an adaptation of Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, called The Story or Whatever of 12th Grade, and also a version of Austen's Emma, called The Emma Agenda from 2017, which features a dreamy lesbian Knightley. And so this is just a sort of sample of some of the things that Piggott has done. And I think as a very sort of young, developing creator, it's an impressive body of work, and it's one that leads on to Piggott's adaptation of Dickens's Favourite Child, which Piggott herself has described as the thing that she is most proud of. So I do think that Public History functions as a kind of conclusion, as a summation of Piggott's literary web series oeuvre as a young person. And interestingly, I think it does closely relate to the broader generic context. And so I think this adaptation, which came out first in 2019, but was first conceived of in 2017, can be categorized alongside other adaptations, not only Maggie Hale's Corner, but a number of other works that came out at the same kind of time. So these include Away From It All from 2016 to 2017, which is an adaptation of Thomas Hardy's Far From the Madding Crowd, which is also a UK-based production, and also Middlemarch, the series from 2017. And these adaptations also play with representations of gender and sexuality in these classic narratives. And interestingly, for our purposes here, they also emerge from the same fandom, from the same adaptation community. So Jules Piggott and Rebecca Shocktor, who is the writer-director of Middlemarch, met each other before the former started filming the Emma Agenda, which I just mentioned. And also Piggott was a crew member for Away From It All, taking the role of assistant video editor in an adaptation that, as I've said, was filmed in the UK, but was very much an international co-production. So you can see that she very much belongs to this world. There's a lot of interconnection, a lot of strong sort of community spirit in the literary-inspired web series world, I think. I think also Dickens's David Copperfield is an interesting candidate in this context, because in contrast to North and South, it is a text that can more obviously be interpreted in a queer or homoerotic context. And homoerotic interpretations of David Copperfield go back at least to 1997, with the publication of Oliver Buxton's analysis of what he calls the eroticized representation of male friendship between David and James Steerforth, and also Uriah Heep. In Buxton's reading, David's passionate admiration for Steerforth plays a key role in motivating the plot of David Copperfield. Ultimately, however, while Dickens's novel offers a significant instance of the coexistence of different narratives of gender identification, its dismissal of David's bad angel, Steerforth, in favor of his good one, Agnes Wickfield, underlines what Buxton calls the text's suppression of deviant desires in order to produce an apparently seamless narrative of heterosexual identity. More recently, and in response to shifting conceptions in homoerotic readings of classic texts, Holly Furneaux has argued more flexibly for the positive acknowledgement of the queer representation central to the David, Steerforth, Emily triad, claiming that Steerforth's displaced fantasy of David's sister is a queer maneuver that fascinated Dickens throughout his career. Furneaux's analysis of David Copperfield is of a piece with her overarching emphasis on the life-preserving rather than the life-threatening, and her aim to move away from a thriving tradition of queer tragedy. And Furneaux argues instead for a genealogy of more positive queer affect and experience in Dickens's fiction. Whether consciously or not, Jules Piggott's retelling of David Copperfield exploits this potential for LGBTQIA+ representation uncovered in this tradition of Dickens criticism. I think this potential, in fact, provided the real genesis for this particular adaptation. When she was looking for another classic text to adapt in 2017, Piggott turned to Copperfield, having just read the novel, I think, for a university course, and been floored by all the subtext and complicated relationships between the characters. So in Public History, the web series David Copperfield, David's admiration for Steerforth also plays a key role in motivating the plot of the first main phase of the web series narrative. In this modernized US high school setting, David has a crush on Jason rather than James Steerforth. And while the latter is also romantically involved with his girlfriend Rosa and David's friend Emily, he does seem interested in reciprocating Copperfield's feelings too. What Piggott's comment underlines is that much of the sexual charge between David and Jason Steerforth does come directly from Dickens's novel. In discussing episode 1.19 of the series with Bradley Ryan Sewell, who's the actor who played David, Piggott explains how the line about David having a sister, that's like straight from the book. Dickens straight up wrote that and expected us not to be like, huh? So in this making of video, she proceeds to pull up the novel on her phone to prove her point. And the moment in question is from chapter 6 of David Copperfield, of course, when Steerforth asks David, "You haven't got a sister, have you?" and comments, "That's a pity. I should have liked to know her." In Public History, the scene, which I'm about to show you now, is modernized and resituated as part of a socially awkward high school party experience. And let's check where we are with the time. Actually, I'll just leave the second video. I'm not sure we quite have time. So, but you can imagine, I've explained it there in my text, you know, that they're at a party together, and there's a sort of modernized, updated, very 21st century version of that scene in chapter 6 of David Copperfield. In the end, Jason does not suffer a watery death like Steerforth does in Dickens's David Copperfield, but after a late, last-ditch attempt to reconcile with David, he leaves the narrative in disgrace after having abandoned Emily and treated his old school friend badly. So Public History does seem to expel the deviant desires that Jason represents, much like the source text did. But interestingly, what it offers up as an alternative is not a safe route to heteronormative adulthood in the form of David's marriage to Agnes Wickfield. The second phase of the romance plot that features centrally in season 2 of Public History functions instead to echo Holly Furneaux as a more positive representation of queer affect and experience. So, After being introduced to bisexuality by his new friend Annie Markham at the end of season 1, David eventually comes to the realization that he is bisexual too. This then leads to a rift with his girlfriend Dora, who was unwilling initially to accept David's coming out video, claiming that it makes her feel insecure and that his experimenting with his sexuality might lead him to meet a guy that he likes more than her. The two do eventually reconcile as friends though, and the Adaptations romance plot comes to a conclusion when David falls in love with Asher Wickens, a male version of Dickens's Agnes Wickfield. You can see here. Public history then shifts the emphasis of Dickens's David Copperfield from a Bildungsroman about the growth of a creative mind into a moving and positive portrayal of the protagonist's discovery of his own sexuality. This queering of Dickens's canonical novel goes beyond public history's tangled romance plots. And so the series weaves a memorable cast of Dickensian gender non-conforming supporting characters around its leads. So David's Salem House schoolmate, Tommy Traddles, becomes Tommy, short for Thomasin, an out lesbian goth with brightly dyed hair, who provides friendship and moral support, much like Tommy in the source text for David in season 1 in particular. The lovable spendthrift and surrogate parental figure, Wilkins Micawber, is transformed playfully into a supportive, non-binary cat dad. There are the cats again, it's the internet, who lives in a house full of felines rather than a house crammed full of children, as in the novel, with their wife, Ella. When David runs away from an abusive home environment towards the end of season 1, he ends up living with his eccentric Aunt Betsy, and just as she does in the source text, Betsy lives with her longtime companion and kite aficionado, but here the difference is that it's of course a woman, and it's not Mr. Dick, it's a character called Fanny. There's a bit of a bad joke there. Whether Betsy and Fanny are in a sexual relationship is not really made fully clear by the series, but nonetheless they form a very loving, unconventional partnership which provides security for David after he loses his mother. And then finally, once our protagonist is settled at his new school in season 2, David becomes a part of a new friendship group that includes not only Asher, who becomes his boyfriend later on, but other supporting characters, Annie, Val, and Jack, who, as a polyamorous throuple, represent a new take on the complex menage a trois of Annie Strong, Dr. Strong, and Jack Maldon in Dickens's novel. Not really sure what Magdalene is thinking of all this as I look out to the audience. So these examples of positive LGBTQIA+ representation I've just explored underscore a quiet radicalism about this aspect of the series. I think it's radical, however, very much in the spirit of Dickens's own openness to an unconventional familial support networks. As Holly Furneaux notes, throughout his career, Dickens was fascinated by the limitations of the family as defined and formed by marriage and reproduction. He continually explores alternative domestic spaces and bonds. So these Dickensian families of choice are transposed, I think, effectively into Piggott's updated LGBTQIA+ friendly domestic spaces, such as the Micawber household and Aunt Betsy's house. And it is in these places that David is able to explore his queer identity. As much as public history might seem to be an adaptation that accentuates a critical reading of David Copperfield, especially in relation to its representations of gender and sexuality, its response to the source text is actually surprisingly sincere and faithful in its recasting of textual detail. And Piggott has been open about her interpretation of Dickens originating out of love and out of a place of fandom. Her strategy is to treat the literary-inspired web series as what she calls a puzzle that necessitates finding different ways to adapt story beats and characters to the modern day. So these adaptive strategies mean that, much like Maggie Hale's Corner, public history moves away from the knowing nods to the classic adaptation genre that are very much an important part of earlier waves of the literary web series. I've got one last example there, which I'll skip over. I'm going to move on towards my concluding remarks, so we have time for some questions. So moving towards my conclusion. It's a common trope of classic adaptation journalistic discourse to grumble about yet another version of Austen, Bronte, or Dickens, but also at the same time to admit that these canonical works need to be reappraised and reinvented for each new generation of viewer. What makes the literary-inspired web series that I've talked about, like Public History and Maggie Hale's Corner, distinctive in this broader context is that they not only provide a fresh take on classic narratives for a new audience, they also represent a reinterpretation of canonical text produced by the younger audience themselves, in a way embodying their own interpretations of these classic narratives. I think that this sets this later era of web series adaptation apart, not only from the classic adaptations produced by major film and TV studios, but also the literary-inspired web series released by Cambly Digital, which, as we heard at the start of the talk, aim to adapt out-of-copyright works for the rapidly expanding young female audience of the early noughties, who were spending an increased amount of time online. The late flowering burst of grassroots, low-budget online creativity, as I've explored here, also represents a response to the gauntlet laid down by two of the most significant web series critics, Jennifer Camden and Kate Faber-Astrike, in their study Transmedia Storytelling. Camden and Astrike note that while web series classic adaptations of an earlier vintage can sometimes offer illuminating new readings that expose the ideological limitations of the source text, they can also reinforce troubling models of gender, wealth, and power. Camden and Astrike hope instead that future producers of transmedia digital adaptations end up using this emerging medium as a means to challenge rather than reintroduce the limitations of 19th century narrative forms and ideologies. And I think Jules Piggott's Public History of David Copperfield web series and Lacey Shaw's Maggie Hell's Corner do exactly that, at least in ideological terms. Retelling 19th century classic texts from an LGBTQIA+ perspective, and more broadly, stressing the continuing relevance of both novelists' social criticism. In doing so, I'd argue that both web series represent a marked generational shift as well, away from the more millennial generation post-feminist interest in female autonomy, I think, which is well represented by the Cambly Digital productions, into Generation Z's more fluid understanding of gender and sexual identities. Analyzing public history and Maggie Hell's Corner closely and in context certainly provides greater insight into the later years of this digital cultural phenomenon. Even more intriguingly, it also helps us to better understand the cultural logic of this particular adaptation community. And this phase of the literary-inspired web series is shaped not so much by the commercial practices of a studio like Cambly Digital, but rather by a loose network of effective fan response, both in relation to the work of other non-professional creators and also to an extent to the classic authors who inspired them. As I mentioned earlier, Lacey Shaw, who made Maggie Hell's Corner, was a young fan of the Lizzie Bennet diaries, and also ended up collaborating with other writers who were members of the web series adaptation fandom. And similarly, Jules Piggott was a fan of web series adaptations like Nothing Much to Do, became a creator herself at the heart of the literary-inspired web series world, and turned finally to Dickens in order to adapt David Copperfield from what she herself calls a place of fandom. Still, as I come to my conclusion, studying and theorizing this adaptation community is still something that I need to engage with more deeply in my own work. I think it's a task that will require different kind of methodologies that move beyond close analysis into more empirical, interview-based or production research into the cultures and the networks of these web series that I've only just begun to study. For now, I just want to leave you with the point that the behind-the-scenes process of finding a sense of community in a chosen fandom is echoed, I think, finally and neatly on screen in Public History. And so at the end of Public History, David moves towards discovering his own healthy support networks. These are provided principally, as I've hinted, by Betsy Trotwood and by Fanny, by the circle of school friends in Dover, and I think these develop eventually into an updated version of Dickensian families of choice. The penultimate episode of the series does end romantically with a passionate kiss between David and Asher, but I think it's interesting that the final episode, All Good Things, turns away from the romance plot and wraps the series up with the protagonist, David, mingling sociably in the park with the rest of the cast. And so in this context, David has become the hero of his own life, to use the words of Dickens, due above all to the help and the influence of the loving and eccentric community of Dickensian characters that surround him.